This evening's presenter, Dr. Navina Najat Haider, has spent 8 years curating the Metropolitan Museum's reimagined Islamic art galleries. Vogue magazine praised this labor of love, saying, quote, "It's hard to think of a greater visual and intellectual feast than walking through the new Islamic galleries at the Metropolitan Museum of Art with Navina Najat Haider, the curator and guiding force behind this huge project during the last 8 years," unquote. The newly organized Islamic galleries feature a Moroccan courtyard and an 18th century Syrian reception room, as well as the many, many other examples of Islamic art in the museum's vast collection. A curator of the Department of Islamic Art since 1999, Dr. Haider has been involved in numerous other projects. Tonight, she will be sharing one of these in a lecture entitled Sufi Romances of the Deccan, the illustrated traditions of the Gulshan or Ishq, flower garden of love. Dar al-Athar Islamiyya is truly delighted to bring to Kuwait one of the most dynamic contributors to the research and presentation of Islamic art. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Navina Najat Haider.
So I'll be speaking to you about a subject that's of particular interest to us at the Met at the moment, and that is the Sufi romances that were made in the Deccan region of India. And I'll tell you a little bit more about this region and about this tradition as we proceed. But before I get started, I really wanted to share with you the image of somebody who's very dear to me and to others here, and somebody to whom I dedicate this lecture, Najat Sultan. She was a great figure of Kuwait and of India, so there's competing claims on her legacy, which was that of a completely original thinker, a dynamic woman who fought for women's rights, but more than anything else had such a love of culture, of art, that she influenced me and many others. So it's a great joy for me to be able to dedicate today's work to Najat Sultan. So now looking at a map of India, you see that the Deccan area is in fact right in the middle there. It's somewhere between the Mughal north and the deep south, as we call it. And in a sense, it's between these two worlds was this plateau area, which was a home to 5 Muslim kingdoms between the 15th and the 17th centuries, and beyond that. The great court of Hyderabad is also located in the Deccan. But in this earlier period, fantastic cosmopolitan and composite culture came about because the Deccan had unique contacts and unique links to this part of the world, to the Arab world, to Europe, to Africa, and to Southeast Asia because of these long coastal areas that were in the Deccan kingdom's controls. And through tremendous trade connections and also through a shared Shia court culture that made the Deccan very close to Iran. Now, of those 5 kingdoms, one of the greatest, most important ones was Bijapur. It lasted for about 200 years, and it's a bit of a lost kingdom. If you go to Bijapur today, it's an 8-hour drive from the nearest big city across very rough terrain. But when you get there, you find the most extraordinary monuments, such as the Ibrahim Rauza, which is the tomb and the funerary complex of one of the great rulers of Bijapur, Ibrahim. And this is a photograph of that place. And these are images of Ibrahim, who ruled in the early 17th century and was one of the most fascinating characters of the Deccan. He was born a Shia Muslim, but he converted the state religion at a certain point to Sunnism and back again to Shiism. And in the Sunni period in particular, the Sufi element in Bijapur became extremely strong. But more than that, he was also deeply attracted to the traditions of Hindu India. And so, for example, you see him here wearing Rudraksha beads, which are the types of beads that Shaivite worshippers in India wear. And here he's holding musical instruments, clappers, that were used in devotional singing in Hindu temples. He was greatly fond of music and culture and literature, and combined and created a kind of complex hybrid of traditions at his court. And I'm really telling you all of this because I wanted you to have a sense of what this complex setting was before we actually look at this manuscript tradition. And you're looking at some of the most famous paintings of Ibrahim, which, by the way, we will be bringing to the Metropolitan Museum in early 2015 for the first ever exhibition on this major subject. Now, as I mentioned, in Ibrahim's period and in the period that followed, Sufism, that is the mystical tradition of Islam, became very well established at Bijapur, and it took many forms. Some of the forms were extremely simple, and this famous painting in the Bodleian shows possibly the most simple form of a Sufi shrine. There is a Sufi, or a dervish, or a mendicant who's seated just under the open skies, and approaching him are certain other figures, and there's a lot of debate about who these figures really are. But I'm really showing that to you to give you a sense of the setting, the open setting, including of wandering figures like this, who are often described as yoginis. In this case, it's a feminine figure known as a yogini, but you also had their male counterparts. And the idea being that in this extraordinary countryside, you had this sort of wandering traditions of holy people loosely attached to different traditions of Sufism, although the main one that we'll be referring to is that of the Shatari tradition that was established in this period too. And of course, there are many great objects from this period related to the Sufi tradition, which is, this, for example, is a beggar's bowl in the David collection. But aside from all these informal places, the major centers of Sufism, and one of the most important ones, is in Gulbarga in the Deccan region. And this is the shrine complex of Gesu Daraz, which literally means long locks. He was famous for his long hair. And this is an early tradition, a sort of late 14th, 15th century tradition that took shape and took form in the Deccan and became a sort of important landmark for the Sufi traditions that followed. So I'm going to start by talking, by sort of taking us into the tradition of the Gulshan-e-Ishq, or the flower garden of love, which is the Sufi romance we will be talking about today. But in terms of background, I should start by telling you that many of the allegorical tales of India, which are termed as Sufi romances, are in fact reworkings of far more ancient narratives which are overlaid with Islamic Sufi mysticism. Characterized by highly emotional and romantic plots, a variety of human and supernatural characters, and vivid imagery and descriptions, this substantial body of literature, going back to as early as the 13th century, has provided rich material for illustrations to artists working at a wide variety of Indian courts. While the literary genre of Sufi romances has been recognized as self-referential in many aspects, with texts developing from and referring to each other, it can be argued that in the artistic sphere, the illustration of romances are often interrelated in a similar way. Unlike better-known texts such as the Shahnameh or the Khamsa of Nizami, the genre of Sufi romances is only now being recognized and properly appreciated and drawn out as a thread within painting traditions. Now, my paper will discuss one such artistic tradition of the Deccan, that of the Gulshan-e-Ishq, or the flower garden of love, written by Mulla Nusrati, and I'll be particularly focusing on a lavishly illustrated copy at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, which is attributed to Hyderabad and dated 1742. I will aim not just to give you a sense of its story, but also to demonstrate how the paintings work together to draw out key aspects of the central theme. The Gulshan-e-Ishq was composed in 1657 by Mullah Nusrati at the Bijapur court of Ali Adil Shah II and takes the form of a masnavi or narrative in rhymed couplets in Dakkani Urdu. Considered to be a reworking of an earlier Awadhi poem, the Madhumalati, and I will explain all these strange-looking names on the screen in just a minute. It's going to make perfect sense, but just bear with me while it's a little complicated to understand this heritage. So the Gulshan-e-Ishq is thought to be a reworking of an early Awadhi poem, the Madhumalati, which was written by the medieval poet Sayyid Manjhan Rajgiri. The Gulshan-e-Ishq, like the Madhumalati, is a symmetrically woven allegorical tale on the theme of divine love through the story of Prince Manohar's quest to attain Madhumalati, with whom he fell in love in a dream. Belonging to a family of interrelated narratives, the Gulshan-e-Ishq follows a series of related texts, illustrated texts, such as the Chandayan, which was written in 1379 by Mullah Dawood, which is the first one here. Then that was a model for the Padmavat, which was written by Jaisi in 1520. Then the Mrigavat, which was written by Sheikh Qutban in 1503. And then we come to the Madhumalati. Now, you might notice that some of these are Indian names, and then you see Islamic names. And this is absolutely typical of the Deccan. They kept a lot of the original old Indian names even while they were in the process of adapting them to an Islamic idiom, which is a fascinating sort of moment to engage with these texts and with this tradition. In the Deccan in particular, the Payme name became quite famous, and then the Gulshan-e-Ishq. Now, I spent a lot of time trying to gather as many copies of the Gulshan-e-Ishq as I could, and I found at least about 25 copies, and this is a list of where they basically are, ranging from collections in India to collections in the United States, and I'm sure there are a great deal more that are only now going to be recognized, because putting all of this material together, you'll see, takes a certain amount of time. So what do these look like? Now, there's a selection of some of the illustrated manuscripts of the Gulshan-e-Ishq. This one in the Prince of Wales Museum. This one is a dispersed copy, which is, I'm going to be arguing, the model for this one, which is the Philadelphia copy that we're going to be talking about. And then here are a couple of others, including one very late one from 1815 in the Philadelphia Free Library. So my survey has indicated to me that in terms of numbers, the Gulshan-e-Ishq appears to have been more popularly copied in the Deccan than some of the other texts that I showed you. The fairly wide variation in style and also quality of the illustrated manuscripts of the Gulshan-e-Ishq imply both different levels of patronage as well as different centers of production in the Deccan. The internal artistic or textual relationships between the manuscripts are not completely apparent, but by focusing on the Philadelphia copy, I will be arguing, as I said, that the dispersed manuscript of 1710 was almost certainly its most direct pictorial model. The Philadelphia Gulshan-e-Ishq is a heavy manuscript bound in handsome red and gold embossed leather bindings and contains over 200 pages with 97 richly pigmented and gilded paintings. Its inner cover contains an early handwritten English notice saying that the book was taken from the Zanana of Tipu Sultan by the British in 1799 at the siege of Seringapatam. The text pages of bold Naskh calligraphy are divided into two columns by gold rules in the conventional manner of Masnavis. The colophon contains the information that the writing of the text was completed in 1742 and adds that the paintings were completed a year later in 1743. The name of the calligrapher, Ahmad ibn Abdullah Nadkar, is mentioned, and there is an implication that he might have been responsible for the paintings too, which is rare but not completely unknown. So far, no further works by this calligrapher or artist, who is possibly a Maharashtran from his name, are known, but the investigation has just begun and will hopefully reveal more information in time. The Philadelphia manuscript also mentions the name of the patron, interestingly, a woman, Sajida Mahtaram, who is not connected so far with any other commissions. The manuscript's later history is not known, but presumably it made its way to the United States through the United Kingdom and eventually became part of the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1945. The opening text pages and illustrations of the Philadelphia manuscript of the Gulshan-e-Ishq bring together several important figures associated with its creation, or who are important symbols of spiritual or worldly power in the Deccan. The first is an unidentified sheikh, almost certainly a Sufi, from his green turban and ostrich egg symbol, but mistakenly labeled in the accompanying rosettes, which accompany the subject of each painting in the manuscript, as the major Sufi sheikh of the Deccan, Ghesu-Daraz, whose shrine I showed you earlier. Ghesu-Daraz is in fact in the next folio, and he is identifiable by his long locks and seated within a floral decorated domed building. So here's Ghesu-Daraz, and you can see that there's some attempt to show that he's got long locks. And here's this mysterious other sheikh, who I hope we can identify one at some point. But there's the green turban, and that element hanging there is an ostrich egg. And if you go to shrines in India today, you find this extraordinary feature of ostrich eggs hanging in the middle of the shrines for some reason that somebody's written a very long and learned article about. So I can give you the reference if you're interested. Now, Sultan Ali Adil Shah II is also invoked among the early painted folios, and a small quarter page depicts the writer Nusrati shown writing the text of the Gulshan-e-Ishq. On the ground before him is the book, which in a witty conceit resembles the red-hued outer leather covers of this very copy. So there is the Sultan to whom the book is dedicated, and there is the writer, and there's his little book, which resembles the outer manuscripts. These opening folios also set the tone of the pictorial idiom that is to follow throughout the manuscript, full-blown illustrations, full-page illustrations for the most part, which retain a flavor of late Golconda style in painting, while moving towards a stiff, more simplified yet strong idiom favored at Hyderabad and some of its provincial satellite courts. Throughout the manuscript, the images are outlined in a bold line and completed in vivid and opaque color, and they also contain a great deal of gold, which has been pricked and chased and pressed to give the folios a rich texture. Another notable feature is the great interest shown in the depiction of textiles and an extravagance of patterning in general, with many of these patterns actually being taken from contemporary textile designs. The planes of floral patterns seen in the previous folios are further intensified in the opening of the narrative. Here, King Bikram, the ruler of Kanakgir, offers alms to a holy man, Roshan Dil, illuminated heart, who refuses to accept since the king is childless. To become worthy of the blessing of a son, the king has to undergo hardship and seeking, symbolic of the challenges of the soul in search of the divine. The text provides several details which appear in the painting. The queen, who personally attends to Raja Bikram every morning on this occasion, was interrupted from serving the meal by the cry of the mendicant outside. There's the queen, and there's the mendicant. She is shown in the palace above. Raja Bikram giving his meal to the holy man is depicted in the register below. Raja Bikram placing his head at Roshan Dil's feet is not shown here, but is mentioned in the text and in another double frontispiece illustrating the same episode in the Noor collection in London. The palace walls in the background are decorated with vases filled with floral sprays. While such floral vases are extensively known in Mughal and Deccani manuscripts and also wall paintings, they are particularly important at Bijapur because they occur as a primary decorative element within an interior sacred chamber at the Asar Mahal, which is said to have a relic from the Prophet, and that is a structure that was built in 1646. Now, on this side of the screen, I'm by and large showing you illustrations from the Philadelphia manuscript, but on the other side, I sometimes will put up related pieces. And this lone manuscript page, which for the longest time had been unidentified, now it's very clear when you look at the episode there and here that in fact it's illustrating the same story. But without the rest of the manuscript, it was very hard to know. Now, this is the double frontispiece from the Noor Collection, London, has been identified as the opening to the dispersed manuscript of 1710 by Linda Leach, and certainly constitutes a grand paired composition showing the same subject. Here, in a fairly complex arrangement, King Bikram is shown on one side offering alms, and on the other, placing his head at the feet of the holy man. In the margins all around are bucolic outdoor scenes, echoing the metaphor of gardens and nature. King Bikram, taking on the guise of a yogi, goes into the forest to search for Roshandil after the initial rejection by the holy man. And this duality, or the absorption of yogic metaphors into the language of the Shatari Sufis in the Deccan, is very much a characteristic of that local tradition. Now, a striking half-page illustration shows the Raja in humble clothes carrying a beggar's bowl, which appears in fact to be a piece of bidri ware, which is a type of local production. Some of you might recognize the bidri. All around him, in a rocky setting reminiscent of the great landscapes characteristic of the Deccan, are fierce animals such as the dragon shown below. The text describes this episode in a highly metaphorical manner. Hardship was a rosary round his neck. Resignation was his bowl. Contentment were the ashes the yogis rub onto their bodies. His sighs played the role of the horn. Patience was used as rings for the ear. Humility was his satchel. Worldly comfort was like the deer hide to be trampled on. In the painting, however, the interpretation is more literal, with most of these elements having a corresponding element, such as a bowl or a satchel. While comparing the same subject from the dispersed circa 1710 manuscript, it is evident that the Philadelphia page is an abbreviated version of the earlier composition. The full-page illustration has been reduced in scale, but retains some of the more dramatic elements, such as the dragon in the lower right. Continuing with the narrative, Bikram comes upon a garden where he sees 7 fairies bathing in a cistern. Bewitched by their beauty and keen to have their help in finding Roshandil, Bikram gathers up their clothes, agreeing to return them only after they agree to help him find the holy man. The verdant garden scene illustrating this episode is a particularly lavish painting, completed with rich color and detail. According to recent scholarship, this scene represents a pivotal moment in the text and an important shift of mood in the tale. Quoting from Ali Akbar Hussein's Scent in the Islamic Garden, garden descriptions are interspersed throughout the narrative and serve to record and mirror the moments of joy and despair, of spiritual awakening or the kindling of love. A moment of respite in a forest garden, perfumed with agar and chandan's trees and illuminated by fairies in a pool, is suggestive of Bikram's spiritual awakening. And of course, the popular subject of Krishna stealing the bathing gopis' clothes was well established in Rajput painting by this time and may also have played some part in the development of this particular composition. Now, the scene on the previous, this one is from the Philadelphia manuscript that I've been talking about, and this is a page, again dispersed, from the circa 1710 manuscript, and this one was found all on its own in another museum in America. And putting them both together, it's very clear that this one has to be based on that. They're so close. But only this morning I was having a very interesting conversation about the importance of style and being able to look very closely at the development of style, and really it's really through contrast and comparison that you have a better understanding of how style works and changes. The point being that this detail from the same page that I showed you before is from an earlier version, and how do we know this one is earlier than that? Even if we didn't know that this was dated 1742, and we in fact don't have a date for this, you can see that the greater degree of refinement and the style of the face itself, which is much more Mughal in its orientation and in its style, is quite different 50 years later from this much heavier treatment, something that's almost more provincial, that is what we see in Hyderabad 50 years after the Mughal influence has waned. these are, two things generally happen when copies get made. Either things become much more simple or they become much more fussy. And in this case, you can see that the simplification is what seems to have happened with the Hyderabad, with the 1742 copy, because this rock, for example, you can see has a vine twining around it and carefully articulated foliage up above, and it's been much more simply rendered over here. And even the faces of the fairies, you can see that there's a greater degree of refinement here, and this is charming, but it's just much bolder and much sort of stouter in its style. And it's always useful to be able to have these very, very close comparisons when you're working on issues such as this. Now, the central subject of gardens is further illuminated by a digression for a moment into the Free Library 1815 Gulshan-e-Ishq manuscript, which is of far more provincial character, but further underscores the relationship between paintings and textiles between this artistic tradition. As in the Philadelphia Museum, manuscript floral imagery continues to form an important visual element in this book. But in the Free Library version, textile motifs or patterns are often adapted without modification into illustrations. This is seen in the example of a folio showing Chandrasen swooning in a garden at the site of Champavati. These are characters who occur slightly later in the narrative. Notably, the garden here has been abstracted into a series of identical repeating blossoms on a plain ground, almost certainly drawn from patterns seen on block-printed and painted textiles of the great Kalamkari tradition of the region. And actually, I think that's one of the sweetest garden scenes I've ever seen, where you can see that he's fainted and everything around him is just this kind of very formal, repetitive pattern. And here's an example of a textile, and here are other examples from that manuscript showing how close the designs are and how direct the adaptation is. Returning to the Philadelphia manuscript, the Philadelphia Gulshan-e-Ishq, the narrative continues, and as it continues, the fairies direct Bikram to Roshan Dil's hermitage, from where he receives a special fruit in order to give his queen, in order for them to have a child. Bearing the fruit, he is then transported back to Kanakgir. The episode is shown here in a charming composition, which is a mirror-reversed and slightly expanded version of the illustration in the folio from the dispersed 1710 manuscript. And I have a close-up here to show you. There is Bikram in the middle, and there are all the fairies. And up on his raised hand, I think in there is actually the magic fruit. At Kanakgir, after the magic fruit has served its purpose, Prince Manohar is born, and he is the real hero of the story. In a skillful change of mood and through the extensive use of white and some areas of silver and green, the painting creates the gleaming palace that is described in the text. The coloristic spareness of the folios in this section of the manuscript show the controlled use of pigments. The silver has been specifically applied to metalwork objects appearing in the composition, including a ewer and basin, spittoon, bedposts, cradle, and other mounts, condiment box, and another covered vessel. The metaphor of light is another major symbolic element in the text, to which this artist is extremely sensitive and is demonstrated in the sequence of paintings that are set in the palace interior. In a celebrated and imaginative composition occurring in both the Philadelphia and the dispersed copy, 9 angels flying overhead are drawn to Manohar's palace below, where he sleeps next to his dai, or nursemaid, who is an important symbol of a Sufi symbol of an interlocutor. She is actually shown sleeping on the floor below, next to him. The fairies transport the sleeping Manohar away to the palace of Madhumalati, the 11-year-old princess of Maharasnagar, whom they consider to be his perfect match. Quoting again from Ali Akbar's scholarship, to the flying fairies, the king's palace in the moonlight is a perfumed mountain, Muambar Jabal, drenched in light. Enveloped in a jewel-encrusted veil, its terraces shimmering like mica, its garden flowers like china cups filled with the milk of moonlight, the palace is an illusion more enchanting than the reality of the heavens it mirrors. Once transported to Madhumalati's palace, a magical night was spent by the lovers together who exchanged rings and bed sheets. But when he awoke, Manohar found himself back in his own palace and distraught fell into his father's lap. The striking use of color, red and white, used to great contrasting effect, corresponds to the text wherein Madhumalati's palace is described as red and beautifully decorated. The bed sheet that Manohar brings back with him expresses through its vivid color, which is intensified against the whiteness around, the intense memory of the princess. Associations can, of course, also be made loosely with the pictorial traditions of Behram-e-Gur, where color symbolism is a prominent feature in paintings of the hero's visits to princesses of various climes. And this is Manohar collapsed. That's him falling into his father's lap, and there's the bright bed sheet in his white palace. Search parties, consisting of clever and steady men, as described by the text, are sent out to look for Madhumalati, but without any success. Eventually, Manohar decides to take leave of his parents and search for Madhumalati himself. At sea, Manohar has terrible adventures, including there he is actually taking leave of his parents, and this is a very Indian way to take leave of your parents, to touch their feet, and his whole flotilla of ships that he's going to be going on are actually filled with tiny Portuguese-style figures, which again was a convention that was very much adapted to images of seafarers, a long tradition coming down from the Mughal period. At sea, Manohar has terrible adventures, including encountering dangerous sea serpents, depicted in dramatic compositions showing the attack of one monster and its own subsequent termination by another, even more fierce specimen. Although his fleet is lost, Manohar survives on a small raft and arrives on land where he enters a dense and mysterious forest where neither sunlight nor moonlight penetrates, called Kajli Ban. At the heart of the Philadelphia manuscript lies one of its most striking paintings, which represents an important spiritual moment in the narrative. In the depth of the Kajliban forest, Manohar encounters a dervish who gives him a magic wheel with which to meet challenges when all else fails. According to the text, having walked for 6 months in the wood known as Kajliban, Manohar saw light. There was a piece of clearing, circular in shape, over which the sun shone. In that ring of light, Manohar could see a hermit sitting who was fully absorbed in meditation. He had, it seemed, reached the zenith of renunciation. His locks of hair stretched out like hanging twigs in which birds had made their nests. His arms and legs were thin like dry sticks, but his body shone like the moon. Since he was thin, he looked like a crescent curved on all sides. His eyes twinkled like stars, but his lips were tight. The wizened figure of the dervish is arresting in its emaciated profile and intense and penetrating gaze. Aditya Behel has pointed out that the nature of the looks exchanged between the two figures, where the holy man stares directly at Manohar, who in turn has an upward and perhaps more inward gaze, may reflect a tradition of Sufi transmission. It is also likely that the treatment of the dervish's figure is partly related to contemporary depictions of the emaciated Majnu, surrounded by wild animals from the classic Persian tale. This artist seems to have been sensitive to the textual description of the ring of light within which the hermit appears. Aside from the light gray color of his blue-gray body, possibly meant to indicate the smearing of ashes, the ground just beyond the outline of the figure has been skillfully pigmented in such a way as to convey a subtle radiance emerging from the dervish's body. It's very hard to see, but maybe you can make it out, that the figure has a slight sort of corona of lightness around it. His hair contains what seem to be tiny yellow birds, appearing somewhat snake-like, in keeping with the description in the text that I just read you. Fierce animals all around him appear docile and apparently tamed in the holy man's presence. They include a dragon in the tree above, tigers below, a scorpion, and several snakes, some curling around his body. In the lower right corner appears a feline with a raised front paw, an unusual element that seems to be related to Deccan metalwork, more specifically incense burners, of which several are known in this form. That's the element that you see down there. It may also be compared to a series of leonine forms appearing on the Chakravartin's seven-stepped throne on a well-known folio of the earlier Bijapur manuscript, the Nujum al-Ulum. Its presence in this present composition might be meant to evoke a reference to the symbol of worldly power. So that's, you can see the symbols here, and it also appears on this incredible open work axe. This is a very, very rare object that, again, we're hoping to borrow for that exhibition that I mentioned. So, things start getting exciting in the story now. Following his encounter with the dervish, the narrative now introduces Champavati, who is Madhumalati's friend, who is rescued by Manohar. She's been captured by an evil demon in a garden palace, in a pavilion, and he's kept her there captive. And Manohar manages to go, and you can see that with the help of his sword and the magic ring, which should be somewhere in there too, he manages to vanquish the demon. Now, Champavati is destined to marry Chandrasen, rescuer of Madhumalati, who is soon to be turned into a bird by her irate mother. Now you must be wondering what's going on. The short answer is that love stories are very complicated, and this is no different. But in fact, all of these figures, these secondary figures like Chandrasen and Champavati, all play allegorical and symbolic roles. Champavati being trapped in this garden pavilion is a symbol in the Sufi way of thinking of love that is trapped. Chandrasen, who comes to rescue Madhumalati later, is again a Sufi value of selflessness. And these are very formal values. They're not just universal values the way we think of them, but they're sort of formalized within the traditions, in particular of the Shataris who we're looking at the moment. Now, eventually, this is Manohar rescues Champavati, and the two of them spend some time planning their escape from the garden. They don patchwork robes, which are intended to disguise Champavati as a man, and both of them as Sufi dervishes. And a final moment in the garden pavilion depicts them thus attired, each pining for their lover and their family. The barren and dry trees all around reflect the inner desolation of the couple, and the setting again conveys the mood and theme of the text through the visual metaphor of the garden. Through the help of Champavati, after she is returned to her kingdom, Manohar and Madhumalati are united in the Farah Bagh, the joy-bestowing garden, a lush and beautiful setting appropriate to their long-desired meeting, and also, again, a great sort of maqam of Sufism, because the whole idea of this text is that the search that the lovers go on takes them through different levels and stations, each of which is properly identified and explored in the text and in the paintings. Several folios in the Philadelphia manuscript are now devoted to the events that take place in the Farah Bagh, and a concentration of garden and pavilion scenes occur again. The interesting thing about the description of the Farah Bagh, and I think it will have special significance for the imagination of Islamic literature, is the huge amount of mention of fruits, vegetables, flowers, and other types of things that are growing in the Farah Bagh. And that is, of course, to do with the high status that was given to plants, to the culture of plants, medicinal plants, and also to associations of these plants in paradisical imagery. But if I told you that at this point the text mentions more than 67 types of trees, 40 types of shrubs, numerous scented plants, and many other sort of natural elements, don't be surprised, because it's quite incredible. It's a sort of document almost of what was grown or what was known in this period. Now, Madhumalati is eventually rescued and, I should just tell you, here they are, the mother who finds the two of them in the Farah Bagh, and then the mother who is so angry turns her daughter into a bird. And why a bird? Because again, in the Shatari system and in other Sufi traditions, there is an idea that there is a universal spirit that roams the world, and it takes the form of a dove. So it sounds sort of crazy, why a bird, just if you read it in a very narrow sense. But you need to really understand all these allegorical sides of the story. So we're coming to the grand finale now, because Madhumalati is, of course, eventually rescued and restored to her human form with the help of Chandra Sen, who I mentioned earlier, the future bridegroom of Champavati. Soon after, Manohar and Madhumalati are reunited, and all the complications of the plot begin to resolve themselves. The Gulshan-e-Ishq reaches its climactic end, with all parties reconciling and each pair of lovers marrying. And among the reconciliations are one of the most again, imaginative moments in the whole thing is when the two men meet, and Manohar is, of course, very grateful to Chandra Sen for having rescued his beloved, and here they are in the garden embracing each other. And I just think that's just, again, a very, very sweet image, typical of this, and lots of scenes of celebration as well. Among the last few images in the manuscript are depictions of lavishly decorated wedding. A palette of red and gold dominates this last section of the manuscript, which is slightly repetitive in its compositional range, because it's just wedding scenes and celebration scenes that go on for quite it's quite a long section. But among the very last images are the depictions of the lavishly decorated wedding canopy of Madhumalati and Manohar, the virtuosity of which deserves comment. The lovers are shown within, lying together on their wedding night. Heavy gold brocade within a floral trellis pattern hangs down on each side, and the artist manages to convey its luster and sheerness through which the faces of the lovers can be seen. I don't know if you can make that out. That's incredibly well painted, because to carry on the line of the face and the feeling of the bodies quite accurately through that layering of gold textile is really shows some skill. Floral motifs and flowers are to be seen everywhere, and wherever gold is applied, it is lavishly pricked, chiseled, and worked. And I'm happy to say that we did try to find such a textile, and I think we found something that in our own Met collection that shows that it must have been this type of textile. You see that you can see it has these kind of opaque areas, but then you can see right through the areas around it. One of the notable pieces of evidence in the Philadelphia manuscript is the presence of several sheets of very thin translucent paper placed between the illustrated folios, which contain tracings of some of the compositions. And they're still in there, and the museum keeps them preserved in there. These appear to have been the means by which these compositions were either derived from another source, presumably the one that I mentioned, or more likely, since these appear to be tracings of these very pages, copied for yet another version of the manuscript. In any case, they confirm the well-established tradition of copying entire manuscripts in the Deccan. In conclusion, the Philadelphia Museum manuscript of the Gulshan-e-Ishq represents a high point in later Deccani painting tradition in terms of its importance as a dated, inscribed, and complete piece of evidence, as well as its manifest artistic merit. As demonstrated, the compositions within its folios are closely derived from an earlier dispersed manuscript of 1710. This earlier manuscript can, on a stylistic basis, be fairly securely placed within the early Hyderabad tradition, an attribution which has traditionally also been extended to this Philadelphia manuscript, meaning Hyderabad. The name of the calligrapher, artist, and patron invite further study towards investigating its place and circumstances of creation and its later Mysore provenance. It is hoped that this survey of a selection of the painted folios of the Gulshan-e-Ishq has demonstrated the manner in which its compositions employ imagery and color in keeping with the text's main metaphorical elements, draw an array of decorative elements from wide sources, and intensify the mood and spirit through a series of imaginative compositions. Thank you very much.